Hey gang, it's Chris, and here's what I've been thinking about. So today I want to talk about politics, and particularly conservatism. Not economic conservatism, which holds that the government is best that governs least, although I will express my strong disagreement on that point. Today I want to take issue with the school of social and political conservatism that opposes change and argues it's defending what it calls American traditions. See, I'd argue that change, more than anything else, is what defines American tradition and the United States as a nation, and I think a review of our history will back that up. Since the US is nearing its 240th birthday, I'd like to break that history up into 30-year chunks, beginning with our independence, and look at what's changed over each of those 30-year periods. Let's begin in 1776 with inarguably the most radical change in American history. We declare ourselves independent from England and announce a new nation formed on the Enlightenment principles of freedom, liberty, and reason. England understandably disagrees with us, declares their strong opposition, and we're forced to go to war to defend our independence. Skipping ahead now to 1806, in our first 30 years as a country, we build a national government under the Articles of Confederation that emphasizes states' rights and autonomy. Then we decide that government didn't work very well, and we build a new one under the Constitution that establishes a stronger federal government. We double the size of our country with the Louisiana Purchase, we establish our first central bank, and we move the capital from New York to Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. The Supreme Court's ruling in Marbury v. Madison fundamentally changes its role in the federal government, and we establish our first two political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. 30 years later now, in 1836. After 3 attempts at it, we do away with central banking entirely. In our first 30 years as a nation, we've already had to fight our second war to defend our independence. We've declared ourselves police of half the globe under the Monroe Doctrine, and we've opened a pathway to the West Coast and the Oregon Trail. We depose a majority of the native people who live on the land we intend to take over, either through warfare, forced relocation, or outright poisoning. The Federalists are no more, but we have a new political party, the Whigs, who run against the Jacksonian Democrats. And around the country, fights are beginning over the institution of slavery and the powers of the federal government that will eventually lead us into the Civil War. By 1836, we've agreed that a white male American doesn't have to belong to any particular religion in order to vote, as long as he owns property. Now let's jump ahead another 30 years to 1866. By now, of course, the United States has very nearly split into two separate nations, fought a war over slavery, and reunified. The Constitution is amended to dramatically change the rules around voting and censorship and to protect the rights of African Americans in the Free South. We reinstitute the central banks, expand the powers of the president, and again increase the size of the nation by annexing the independent nation of Texas and by pushing more natives off other land we'd like. We also do away with slavery, which, apart from being a deplorable and unforgivable violation of everything the United States has ever claimed to stand for, was also the single strongest pillar of our national economy. We changed the way we get around by constructing massive networks of railroad, which require both enormous government investment in infrastructure and also an expansion of the government's powers of eminent domain. And we have yet another political party system, as the Whigs are on the outs and the Republicans arrive on the scene. Before we move on, please do note that I said the Civil War was fought over slavery and not over states' rights. Anyone who says otherwise is wrong. The Confederacy and the Union were actually very much in agreement about having a strong federal government. What they disagreed on was how that federal government would enforce one issue: slavery. The Confederate States wanted their strong federal government to enforce pro-slavery laws nationwide, by requiring northern states to return fugitive slaves to their masters, and by forbidding northern politicians from debating or disparaging slavery in Congress. And the northern states didn't want that. But let's move on to 1896. In the years after the Civil War, the United States fundamentally alters its economy, moving from agrarian farming into industrial production. As a result, populations move into the cities. Railroads crisscross the nation, which on a map looks pretty much as we know it today, except that a few states aren't yet official. Labor unions form to combat the rampant abuses of American workers, and new federal laws are passed both to address the concerns of the unions and to nullify their power. We create a National Park Service to protect wild places, and federal laws are passed to combat trusts and business monopolies. In the 30 years since 1866, the federal government has gone from strong protections for the rights of freed blacks in the South to abandoning them to black codes, the Ku Klux Klan, and separate but equal. The United States has just about wrapped up its genocide of the Native American Indians, going to war against the last few tribes that dare to stand their ground and committing a grotesque massacre at Wounded Knee. While we've managed to keep the same two political parties for once, their platforms have changed dramatically. 1896 begins the 20 years known as the Progressive Era, in which the Republican Party will radically reinvent the structure of government and its role in the everyday lives of the people. Over the next 30 years, from 1896 to 1926, the government of the United States will change more than it has probably since its inception. We fight our first World War, instituting our first national draft and transporting soldiers across the Atlantic to Europe to fight for American interests overseas. We reinvent our central banking yet again with the creation of the Federal Reserve. We extend the right of suffrage to women, institute a federal income tax, ban the sale of alcoholic beverages nationwide, and create a new nationwide police force in the FBI. We lead the creation of, and then refuse to participate in, the first worldwide coalition of governments dedicated to peace, the League of Nations. The United States becomes a globally dominant industrial powerhouse, and the New York Stock Exchange, now occupying, no pun intended, its new home on Wall Street, becomes a household institution, which may not be a good thing. The ensuing crash and Great Depression initiates strong new regulation on the U.S. banking industry, and in the 30 years from 1926 to 1956, the federal government expands dramatically. As part of its response to World War II, the country begins a period of rapid armament, building a massive arsenal of conventional and nuclear weapons, and initiating what President Eisenhower will later refer to as the military-industrial complex, an economic triangle that dominates our federal budget to this day. Politically, we still have the Democrats and the Republicans, but their roles have shifted so much in the last 60 years that they've nearly reversed. The Democrats advance liberal policies, while the Republicans move more toward conservatism and opposition. From 1926 to 1956, the government makes enormous investments in war, including the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb, and huge investments in infrastructure through New Deal initiatives like the Works Progress Administration. Our role in global politics expands as never before, as the United States officially becomes one of two world superpowers and kicks off a decades-long Cold War against the Soviet Union. We create enormous national savings accounts called trust funds to support programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Thanks to a burgeoning economy, economic and banking reforms, and programs like the GI Bill, from the 1920s to the 1950s, the United States moves from the Gilded Age, an era of dramatic social and economic inequality, into the most economically egalitarian and prosperous era in American history. By 1986, the American economy shifts dramatically once again, from industry to science and technology, leaving many American cities rusting and collapsing without jobs and without money. Our banking policy shifts as well, as we abandon many of the reforms and regulations that came in after the Great Depression and enter another period of booms and busts. Politically, the Republican Party over 30 years has moved solidly into conservative policies. The civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s leads to new laws protecting the rights of black Americans, and America's involvement in the Korean and Vietnam Wars, neither of which involves an actual declaration of war, forever changes the way the federal government approaches warfare. The way we live also changes enormously. The proliferation of automobiles and the completion of the federal interstate highway system facilitate the creation of suburbs. Americans in large numbers take up commuting, abandoning train travel for that of automobiles, and increasing our dependence on petroleum and gasoline. The proliferation of suburbs has serious consequences, including air and water pollution, the loss of farmland and natural space to suburban sprawl, the decay of major American cities as they steadily lose their populations and tax revenue, and increasing cultural division of our population, as physical and geographic barriers grow between the poor, working class, and wealthy communities. That brings us to today, 2013. 27 years into the 8th 30-year period in United States history. What have we done with those 27 years? For starters, under the war on drugs, we've entered an unprecedented era of mass incarceration of American citizens, at great cost both financially and in human rights. Between 1986 and 2006, the population of American prisons rises from approximately 750,000 to about 2.5 million. While the Cold War ends, the new war on terror once again revolutionizes the way the United States approaches warfare, as Congress grants the president almost unlimited powers to wage war anywhere around the globe. The Patriot Act and other reforms to the executive branch following the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 drastically changed American policy both at home and abroad, altering the interpretations of several constitutional amendments or suspending them altogether in the interest of security. Economically, the loosening of tariffs and opening of global trade further shift the economy to the point where most consumer goods are manufactured overseas, and economists begin to refer to the United States as a service economy. Banking deregulation leads the country into another catastrophic stock market collapse, and thanks to globalization, this one threatens to bankrupt a good portion of the world. In response to this economic disaster, many Americans begin to push to end the social policies that have defined the United States since the Great Depression. In 3 years, we will enter a new 30-year period, one that will lead us through the year 2046. I wonder what will change in those 30 years. What I can say for sure is things will change. This is exactly what frustrates me when I hear from so-called conservatives who say they're defending American traditions by opposing change. The greatest tradition I see in American history is the willingness and wherewithal to admit that your country isn't perfect and the initiative to make the changes to make it better. If you're in your mid-30s like I am, then chances are your great-great-grandmother, a person one of your parents very likely knew, was born into a country where women didn't have the right to vote, where there was no income tax, no FBI, and no selective service. When she traveled, she probably did it by train, and she might not have been allowed aboard if she didn't have a male escort. If you're African American, your great-great-grandmother at some point in her life probably knew a living relative who was a freed or fugitive slave. And if you're Japanese and your family's been in the US for a while, forget your great-great-grandparents. Odds are pretty good that your grandparents, and maybe even your parents, were locked up in an internment camp during World War II. My point is, things change, and they change fast. It is neither radical nor unpatriotic to look at your country and recognize things that you think could be better and work to fix them. It's human nature to fear change. But it's American to embrace change and make things better for future generations. Before I wrap up, I want to thank John Green and Crash Course U.S. History, which has helped me relearn my American history as an adult, and my high school teacher, Mr. O'Donovan, who did his best to teach me U.S. history when I was a lot younger and less interested. There's a link below for Crash Course. I'm afraid I don't have a URL for Mr. O'Donovan. If I've forgotten some major change from U.S. history you think is important, and I'm sure I must have done so, please do let me know in the comments below. Until then, thanks for watching, thanks for thinking, and thanks for following the campsite rule and leaving this country better than it was when you arrived.